Right. I'm David Roth, and I am here with David Palmer, and we are discussing Chapter 6 of Skinner's Verbal Behavior titled Special Conditions Affecting Stimulus Control. Before we jump into the content of this chapter, I'd like to just kind of read for anybody who's listening the opening paragraph, which seems like a really good introduction to the topic itself. So, the opening paragraph, Skinner says, generalized reinforcement is the key to successful practical and scientific discourse. It brings the speaker's behavior most narrowly under the control of the current environment and permits the listener to react to that behavior most successfully in lieu of direct contact with the environment. When the correspondence with a stimulating situation is sharply maintained, when the listener's inferences regarding the objective situation are most reliable, we call the response objective, valid, true, or correct. And then Skinner goes on to say that stimulus control is, however, never perfect. All right, so in the previous chapter discussions that we've had, we have kind of opened the discussion with an example from an experimental analysis of behavior. And so in order to venture into the topic of how special conditions affect the stimulus control of behavior, before jumping into that topic, I would like to summarize a study that was done in 1982 by three researchers, Robert Lanza, James Starr, and B.F. Skinner. And the title of that paper is, quote, Lying in the Pigeon. So the way that this study was done was initially it replicated the conditions of a study that was done, or experiments that were done with B.F. Skinner and his doctoral student, Robert Epstein. And for anybody who's listening, it may be useful for you to go onto YouTube and type into the little search bar Doctors Robert Epstein and B.F. Skinner with Pigeons Part 1, and then fast forward 7 minutes in, and you will see exactly the study that I'm trying to describe here. And it'll a video paints 1,000 words. So in that study, essentially what they did, or those experiments, essentially what they did was they had two pigeons, one named Jack and one named Jill. And each pigeon was in its own operant chamber, but the operant chambers were connected to one another with a transparent barrier. So each pigeon could see each other's behavior. Now, the way it was set up was that Jack was on the left side, and he had three discs that he could peck. One was red, one was green, and one was yellow. He also had these other two discs in there. One said, "What color?" and the other one said, "Thank you." And then in Jill's chamber, she had three discs, but they weren't the colors red, green, and yellow. They were the letters R, G, and Y. And then Jill had a little kind of a window in her compartment that had a curtain over it. And behind that curtain was an actual colored disc. It was either red, green, or yellow. And the reason for the curtain is that Jill could essentially see this stimulus, but it was a completely private stimulus for Jack. Jack had no access to what was behind the curtain. So Jack needed, speaking loosely, Jack needed Jill to provide the information to him in order for them to access reinforcement. So what they trained Jack and Jill to do was that Jack eventually learned that, acquired the behavior of pecking the disc that says what color. And when Jack pecked what color, Jill observed Jack do this, and then Jill would go behind the curtain and see what color was illuminated. And it might have been red, it might have been green, it might have been yellow. Whatever color it was, Jill then observed it, and then she went over to the letter discs of R, G, and Y and pecked either R, G, and Y corresponding to what color she saw. Jack was able to observe which color she reported, and then he was able to then go over to the thank you disc. He pecked thank you. Jill got some reinforcement for providing information to Jack. And then Jack went over to the 3 different colors and picked the one that corresponded to whatever Jill's report was. This was the original experiment done with Epstein and Skinner. Now, in this current study, they manipulated one variable. So what they did instead was that now, while Jack and Jill would contact reinforcement in the previous experiments, the same amount of reinforcement for accurate reports of what color was behind the curtain. In this experiment, they were still provided reinforcement for accurate selections of the color. But the difference was that any accurate selection to the color red was differentially reinforced with longer periods of time with the food. So if Jack asked Jill what color, Jill saw that it was red, and then she pecked red, and then he reported red. They both acquired lots and lots of reinforcement. If the colors were green and yellow, accurate reports to green and yellow were still reinforced, but with less amount of time with the food. Now, the results of the study are really interesting. So essentially what happened was that even though both of these pigeons could reliably report the accurate colors, within the previous experiments, when red was reinforced more densely than green and yellow, essentially each of the pigeons had a tendency to quote unquote lie. In other words, but they would only lie about green and yellow, not red. So anytime that Jill saw red, and she would invariably peck the R disc accurately, and Jack would invariably report red to the experimenter. So they didn't ever quote unquote lie about red, but whenever the actual color behind the curtain was green or yellow, there was an increased tendency for each of them to report red incorrectly. And they never received reinforcement for reporting red incorrectly. Despite that, so they both essentially lied whenever they lied more frequently when they contacted the green and yellow colors. What's interesting is that it took 15 days for them to contact extinction for lying about red before they eventually started to quote unquote tell the truth about what the color was behind the curtain. So that is a summary of the study about lying in the pigeon, and what I think is a great example of Skinner's point about how stimulus control is never perfect. Dave, is there anything you would like to say about that study before we jump into the content of chapter 6?
Only to remind listeners who don't know about this experiment, not remind, but tell them that the experiment was sort of painstakingly built up. This was not the terminal. The pigeons were not thrown into this contingency right off the bat. They were trained. Jill was trained to peck R in the presence of red and G in the presence of green, and so on. Before the communicative contingency with Jack was set up. So Jill was reliably tacting, if you will, the correct colors when the experiment began. So they didn't have to start from scratch with lots of errors and so on. Jill was reliably tacting the colors, and Jack was reliably pecking thank you and pecking the corresponding colors to R, G, and Y. That is, I didn't want the listener to think that you could just throw pigeons into this experiment cold and have this behavior, this pattern emerge without any prior experience. But anyway, I agree. It's a beautiful example of Skinner's point that tacts can be distorted by motivational variables, or are impure if they're distorted by variables.
And one thing that I wanted to, talk about with you a little bit was kind of two broad examples of how stimulus control or reports of stimulus control can be distorted. That Skinner showed an interest in each of understanding each of these different phenomena. So one example, one category is when essentially somebody misperceives a stimulus as something else, where they essentially just get it wrong and they report the incorrect stimulus, versus what Skinner calls an impure tact, where the motivational variables are imposing upon the stimulus control contingencies. So in Science and Human Behavior, Skinner talks about a study that was done Harvard in 1945 by Bruner and Postman, and Bruner and Postman were investigating the phenomenon of perceptual behavior. And basically, what they did was they took a traditional deck of playing cards, and they would show the deck to their participants for like just very, very brief periods of time. And they would ask their participants to essentially tell them, what card they saw and what color it was. So they would be shown, a 5 of clubs, and the participants would say, I see a black 5 of clubs, or I see a 3, I see a red 3 of hearts, and so on and so forth. For some of the cards, though, Bruner and Postman painted over the colors so that they were reversed from the colors in a traditional deck of cards. So some of the cards might have been a red 10 of clubs, or a black 6 of hearts. And what they found in this study was that many of the participants, when they would see, the playing card that had the opposite color in place from the traditional deck, if they saw a red 10 of clubs, some of these participants didn't report it as being black or red. Instead, they've reported it as being a purple 10 of clubs. And Skinner interpreted this as an effect in which conditioned seeing kind of fuses with unconditioned seeing, and participants are actually seeing purple because of the effects of these two behaviors on the stimuli that they're confronted with. And this is really important for this topic, because it would be wrong for us to say that the participants were lying by calling it seeing purple. And so Skinner was really interested in understanding the phenomena of perceptual behavior. And in his notebooks, he has several examples of being surprised by his own misperceptions in the world around him. And for the listener, I just wanted to read one example taken out of notebooks. So this is a note that he wrote in 1972, and it was titled Perception. He said, I had placed my coffee cup on a small slip of paper to protect my desk. Busy with other things, I reached for the cup and put it to my lips. Something fell on my other hand. I felt it as a drop of water and reached to wipe my hand after putting down the cup. Then I saw what had fallen was the slip of paper, which had gone past my hand and was on the floor. The procedure of picking up a cup and putting it to one's mouth has preceded drops of fluid on various parts of one's body and clothing thousands of times. In each case, some effort is made to wipe up. And then he says, in addition to acting to wipe my hand, it is quite correct to say that I felt the stimulus as a drop of liquid. So here he's saying, he wasn't lying to himself about it being a drop of liquid. He actually felt a drop of liquid on his hand. Dave, is there anything you would like to say about all of that content?
No, those are just wonderful examples of imperfect stimulus control, but we wouldn't call them lying. They're the stimulus conditions evoke this response reliably without any special sort of self-serving motivation to respond in that way. So these would be examples of distorted stimulus control.
Yeah. So these examples of distorted stimulus control are in contrast to the phenomenon that the layperson typically describes as lying, and that Skinner kind of classified as an impure tact. So Skinner very briefly says on page 153 that lying can be described as a stimulus control phenomenon in which special consequences produce a complete break with the stimulus. So in the case of Jack and Jill, whenever they reported the actual stimulus that was green or yellow, whenever they reported it as red, there was just a complete break with the actual stimulating conditions, because those motivating variables that were the result of a history of special measures of reinforcement onto the contingency, they didn't misperceive it as those colors as being red. There was just a complete break. It was just the motivational variables took over altogether. And Skinner describes an example of how this phenomenon can happen, in everyday life, with maybe a young boy who loses a penny that he once had, and he says to an adult, an actual, a response that is accurately described by the stimulating conditions. He says, "I lost my penny." That's kind of attacked, but he's just reporting it to the adult. He's not expecting the adult to suddenly reach into their pocket and pull out a penny and say, "Here, you can have my penny to replace yours." This was a special effect of reinforcement that was unexpected in that moment. But now, because of that history of reinforcement for saying "I lost my penny," the child is now more likely in the future to say "I lost my penny" to other adults in the future, even though he didn't lose his penny. And we would describe that as lying in lay-friendly terms. And this is the classic example of the boy who cried wolf. So, the boy suddenly learns that people come running at him when he says wolf. And so he starts saying wolf even when there's no wolf present. And eventually people stopped listening to him, it stopped reinforcing the behavior. And maybe it took, just like it took Jack and Jill 15 days for accurate reports of stimulus control to occur. Maybe that's how long it took for the boy who cried wolf. So Dave, any comments on the lying in contrast with distorted stimulus control?
No, I think you've done a good job with great examples. Those are wonderful illustrations.
Great. All right. Okay. Now, Skinner in this chapter kind of ventures into a bunch of other different really interesting topics related to stimulus control. And one of the things that he said that he talks about is the importance of using concrete terms over abstract terms. And this is going to be another paragraph that I'm going to read from Skinner's chapter on page 158. And I know that you have some comments that you'd like to make about what Skinner is saying here. So on page 158, Skinner said, "It has often been pointed out that concrete terms usually have greater emotional effects than abstract. The difference is that the concrete term, in the sense of a response under the control of a particular stimulus, is more likely to coincide with emotionally effective stimuli. The abstract term, being controlled by a property of a large class of events, is not likely to be affected by any other event frequently correlated with that property. For the same reason, the concrete term is likely to generate conditioned seeing, that is, to evoke images. The abstract term, controlled by a property common to a large number of instances, is not likely to be associated with a stimulus appropriate to a single act of seeing." So Dave, I would love to hear your thoughts on the importance and relevance of this paragraph that Skinner had said.
Well, it struck me that it was quite appropriate to the advice of stylists and experts on writing that encourage people to use specific, definite, concrete terms in their writing, as opposed to vague, abstract generalizations. Probably many listeners or readers of Skinner's book are familiar with the style manual by Strunk and White called The Elements of Style. It's very widely prescribed in elementary English classes, college English classes, as a sort of Bible of good writing tips. And they have a particular fetish about using concrete language. And this comment of Skinner's tells us why that advice is good, because the abstract term is, as Skinner says, is controlled by a property common to a large number of instances and is not likely to be associated with a stimulus appropriate to a single act of seeing. Well, that's a specific example of a general case that the concrete term evokes behavior in the listener that is specific and specific, whereas the abstract term doesn't have that kind of evocative effect. And so Skinner's analysis seems to underlie this advice about good writing.
Would you say that an example of an abstract term could be like a description of one's emotions or feelings in response to an event? Or do you have an example of maybe an abstract term would be ineffective in comparison with a concrete term in a description?
Yes, I'm going to quote the passage from the Strunk and White handbook. It's on page 15 for those of you who want to follow along. The advice is to use definite, specific, concrete language. Then below that, they say, prefer the specific to the general, the definite to the vague, the concrete to the abstract. To show what happens when strong writing is deprived of its vigor, George Orwell once took a passage from the Bible and drained it of its blood. Below is Orwell's translation, and then there's the verse from Ecclesiastes. So I'm going to read the verse from Ecclesiastes first. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Many listeners will recognize elements of this passage because it's very widely quoted. But notice that how the passage is concrete because he's talking about specific images. The race is not to the swift, the battle to the strong, bread to the wise, riches to the men of understanding, time and chance, and so on. Here's Orwell's translation that sounds as though it was written in an APA style in some psychological journal. And here it goes. Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena compels the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must inevitably be taken into account. Now that's a good translation, but it's not memorable. And it's speaking as a sort of a dullard. When I hear something like that, my brain shuts down, so to speak. That is, I can't make any sense out of stuff like this. But it is, in fact, a faithful translation. Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena. So that's the substitution for the race is not to the swift, battle to the strong, bread to the wise, riches to men of understanding. Those are the contemporary phenomena of which he's talking. Success or failure exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity. So it's just a clear example of the advantage of a vigorous style over a vanilla pudding style. And I think the nice thing about it is that Skinner's analysis explains it in behavioral terms. It's no longer just advice to a stylist. It explains why that is the case. The abstract term does not evoke the same kinds of discriminative or conditioned responses in us that the concrete term does.
So Dave, I just thought of an example that the listeners can actually relate to within this conversation. So in the beginning of the conversation, I kind of painted the picture of the lying and the pigeon experiment for them. And if they hadn't seen the video and they were just listening to me, they may or may not have actually understood what was going on in the study. Now, the terms telling the truth and the terms lying, I would venture to say that those are kind of abstract terms. And I could have used those terms instead to describe the study where I just said, and then Jill, she lied about red, but she didn't lie about green and yellow. And Jack, he told the truth, most of the time about, when it was, he told the truth all the time about red and most of the time about green, but he often lied about yellow. And that's basically the gist of the study.
Yeah.
But instead, what I did was I described the very concrete events that happened in the study itself in an effort to, as Skinner said, to generate conditioned seeing. And what Strunk and White say is that concrete words call up pictures. So they're both kind of talking about the same kind of phenomena there. And then it seems that another example of kind of abstract terms would be just if I was describing an event to you by just describing my feelings about the event versus the actual event, concrete terms related to the event itself. And I'm recalling an example about an event that I had in my own house. So I have a fire pit in my backyard, and I've not yet to use the fire pit except for this, one occurrence that happened this year. And I put all this dry wood in there, and I lit the fire, and I was outside, and the fire did get kind of large at times. It was probably about about 4.5 feet high at one point when it started to peak. And then as I was sitting by the fire, and I had a hose ready, you know, I was safe in all the right ways, and I heard this distant sound of fire engines just as I was doing that, and I thought that was quite the coincidence, that I was looking at this large fire and hearing fire engines in the distance. Um, and over time, the passage of time, it didn't sound like the sound of the fire engines were getting any farther away. It sounded as though they were circling the perimeter of where I was standing. And I started to get a little, um, unsure if this had any relation to my actual event of lighting the fire. So I had texted my wife and said, who was inside, and I said, um, I sure hope those fire engine sounds aren't because I'm lighting the fire. Ha ha ha. You know, and sure enough, within about 2 minutes, there was a giant fire engine parked right in front of the house. And then the fire chief was parked right next to it. And there were lights everywhere. Um, and the head of the fire chief himself came out of the fire truck, and he walked into my backyard, and I ran over to the hose and I started immediately putting out the fire, and he came over and he had a notepad, and I just knew in that moment I was getting a citation and I had done something terribly wrong and illegal. So that was a really eventful moment throughout my past year. I could have just said, I was lighting a fire and I heard fire engines in the distance and I got kind of worried, but suddenly the fire engine showed up. I was so embarrassed. I was mortified, and I would just describe these feelings to you. And I'm predicting that for anybody that's listening to the two different stories, me having used the concrete terms in the first example probably had a much more evocative effect for the listener than me just describing these vague feelings.
Yeah, I could hear the fire engines. I was picturing this big gigantic hook and ladder in front of your house, and this big gruff guy with a helmet on, stumping out of the car and coming over in a rather authoritative way. And so I was following it all in this little private movie of my own. So my conditioned perceptual behavior confirms your expectations about that.
And that you just described it as this hook and ladder, and then you described the features of the way that the chief might have been walking actually did the same for me. So Skinner, in his autobiographies, he, according to Julie Vargas, he had modeled his writing style for those books after Jane Austen. And he explained that Jane Austen was a master at using concrete terms when describing the behavioral events of others, rather than describing just these subjective feelings that characters might be feeling. And Skinner did the exact same thing in his 3-part autobiography. And he described his style as leaving the emotional experiences to the reader themselves, rather than telling them how he was feeling in the moment. And so, in other words, he used concrete terms to describe behavior rather than the feelings generated by behavioral events. And he has a quote in the 3rd part of his autobiography, on pages 398 to 399. And this is an abbreviated version of the quote, but he said, "There are several reasons why I have not often reported my feelings. Paleontology is a science of bone, teeth, and shells, because the softer parts of organisms have disappeared. And feelings are softer parts too." I really like that analogy that he draws there. It's the concrete terms being the bone, the teeth, and the shells, and the abstract terms being those, softer feelings that don't have that same effect on the listener or the reader as the concrete terms. So great. Okay. So yes. Yes.
An illustration that the effect on the listener is to evoke conditioned perceptions is that my reporting of your incident wasn't a verbatim account of what you said to me. You didn't call it a hook and ladder. I call it a hook and ladder. You didn't say that the guy was big and gruff. You described him in different terms, but I was responding to my own behavior as a listener rather than to the actual verbal stimuli that you presented. So that's another illustration of the evocative effect of these concrete terms as opposed to abstract.
Yes, and I would like to point out to anybody that might be listening on the B.F. Skinner's website and community pages, there is a continuing education unit course that is a talk that you gave at an ABA conference in Florida on this very phenomenon of the behavior of the listener and the behavior of the reader, and how one responds to one's own responses to stimuli. And I can't recommend that talk highly enough to understand more deeply this content that you had just described. Okay. All right. So another area of interest related to special conditions affecting stimulus control that Skinner discusses is the phenomenon of, this is responding to one's own behavior as a listener. So the reinforcing effect from the listener, him or herself. So we have talked in previous discussions about the phenomenon of achieving parity. I do refer the listeners to our discussion from chapter 4, but essentially Skinner kind of describes in more detail what that phenomenon is. If it's okay with you, Dave, I would like to ask if you wouldn't mind just kind of briefly summarizing what that phenomenon actually is of achieving parity.
Yeah, young children find it helpful to do what people around them are doing because they don't know how the world works until they've actually experienced it. But if you do what someone around you is doing, you're likely to get the same kinds of reinforcing consequences that they get. So broadly speaking, there are general contingencies for imitating the behavior of people around you, and that goes for verbal behavior as well. Since most people can hear themselves, they can, if they know how something is supposed to be said, then they don't need the verbal community to shape up correct responding. It can be shaped up automatically through, you might call, trial and error. An example would be learning to whistle, where you know what whistling sounds like, you don't know how to do it. So you have to purse your lips. But you can't just purse your lips and blow out. You have to kind of modulate the opening of your lips just right in order to get a whistling sound. And nobody teaches you to do that. You just the reinforcement is immediate and automatic in the fact that you can hear yourself when you do it correctly. And it's the same thing with pronunciation. You can tell when you've said something like an adult or like an older sibling. So a good deal of the shaping of verbal behavior is through this automatic reinforcement mediated by the listener repertoire of the child, which usually precedes the speaking repertoire. That is, most children are competent listeners before they become effective speakers, and they can in effect teach themselves to say things correctly. Analogous to picking out a tune on a piano. Even if you don't know anything about a piano, if you know how a tune goes, you can sit down on the piano and pick out the tune, pick out the melody, it won't be Vladimir Horowitz or anything, but it'll be you'll be able to pick out the major theme of virtually any song through a kind of trial and error in which your listener repertoire is doing the reinforcing and your finger repertoire is doing the speaking, so to speak.
In that same section where he's talking about the reinforcing effects, the special reinforcement from effects upon the speaker himself, he has a brief little paragraph where he talks about a really interesting phenomenon that I really appreciated. And it's on the bottom of page 164 into page 165. And he says that because the speaker and listener can occur within the skin of the same individual. In other words, we talk to ourselves, and when the speaker and listener are within the skin of the same individual, there are special effects that occur that wouldn't happen when the speaker and listener are separate individuals. And he says that one of the effects is that the topographies of the behavior may deviate from conventional form. And so he says, responses may lack precision and modified forms may appear. This is evident in the handwriting with which one keeps a notebook compared with the handwriting with which one writes letters. The notebook is more likely to show idiosyncratic word signs or abbreviations, not to mention letter forms. Standard responses may fall under more and more unusual stimulus control. Deviant grammatical forms may go undetected. Ambiguous responses are not ambiguous to this listener. The speaker, who is primarily affected by his own responses as listener, tends to be concerned with favorite topics and terms, with literary allusions carrying prestige value, and with stories which the speaker himself finds amusing or interesting, and so on. So I found that interesting because he talks about at different times in this book how the speaker and listener he says at some point that when they talk about some stimulus condition, they pull from the same sources because they both have the same reinforcement histories and they speak the same exact language. That communication between the speaker and listener within the same skin is extremely efficient, and that is evidenced by when there are public forms of how we speak to ourselves, such as writing a letter, a note to oneself. It is legible only to oneself and not to anyone else. I thought that was really interesting, and I also think that's interesting because it speaks to how rapidly we can problem solve situations when we are our own problem solvers. Sometimes it seems like we can emit novel behaviors in a circumstance without even thinking about it. But really what's happening is that thinking has undergone so many idiosyncratic forms that its efficiency is just, it's rapid in a way that is unique to the speaker and listener within the same skin versus between two individuals.
Yeah, that's great. That's a wonderful passage. I mean, Skinner's book is so rich with these little insights that would just go under the radar in most analyses. But that is so true. We mutter to ourselves, but we fully understand what we're muttering. And we scribble to ourselves, we scribble some little poorly penned note, but it makes sense to us when we get to the grocery store and we have to figure out what's in the note. Skinner's handwriting was horrible, or rather, I should say, Skinner's handwriting was difficult to read by a by anyone else,
Mhm.
not to him.
Yeah. Um, okay. And then one of the other areas that Skinner ventures into about how certain variables can distort stimulus control and distort reports of stimulus control. He has a section on the punishment of verbal behavior and how punitive consequences can affect how an individual responds to stimulating conditions in the future. Um, so, so for the listener or any listeners of this conversation, I would just like to briefly touch on, how Skinnerians talk about the phenomenon of punishment, because there are currently, it appears that there are two possible interpretations of how punishment works in the field of behavior analysis. And one interpretation is that punishment is essentially the opposite of reinforcement. So reinforcement increases the future frequency of behavior under stimulus control, and punishment, according to this explanation, automatically decreases the future frequency of that behavior under those stimulating conditions. But Skinner opposed the definition that punishment is a principle that is separate from reinforcement and opposite of reinforcement. And he explains that punishment, the effects of punishment in reducing the frequency of behavior in the future, is an indirect one. And it is the result of incompatible behavior that has been negatively reinforced by the avoidance or the escape from punitive contingencies. So in other words, in Science, Human Behavior, he gives an example, I believe, of a child in church next to his mother, and he speaks loudly during church, and the mother reaches over and I think pinches the child as a form of punishment. And the immediate effect is that the child stops talking in church, and so the behavior has been described as being punished. And then if we continue to watch the future frequency of that behavior in that context, the child does successively reduce his tendency to speak out loud in church. So his behavior has been successfully punished. But what Skinner says is that systematically what happens is that because the behavior itself has been reliably paired by an aversive stimulus, such as the pinch, that just the mere properties of the behavior of talking in church become aversive in themselves and something for the child to avoid in a sense, or escape. So if the child engages in some incompatible behavior, such as pursing his lips shut whenever the tendency to talk arises, and pursing his lips shut has reliably escaped the effects of the punitive effects from the mother's disapproval or attempts to pinch or anything. And therefore, we see an increase in the incompatible behavior, which indirectly can also be described as a decrease in the punished behavior. So that latter example is Skinner's explanation of how punishment works. Dave, is there anything you'd like to say about those two different categories?
Well, only that the field largely has abandoned Skinner's interpretation of punishment and gone with Azrin and Holtz and Azrin's interpretation, which is that the punishment can be regarded as a direct suppression of behavior, that there's no need to talk about this rather complex interplay of conditioned emotional responses and escape behavior and so on, that we can just look at punishment as a direct, having a direct opposite effect on behavior. And empirical studies with rats demonstrating that from a operational point of view, that seems to be true. But I'm not convinced by Asarin's work that that is one can get along pretty well arguing that punishment has a direct effect. That is, it matches the data reasonably well. But I don't believe that well, I should back up and say, I don't believe that we have a good understanding of the physiological bases of punishment. But to the extent that we do, they aren't the reverse of reinforcement. That is, reinforcement has a strengthening effect that potentiates pathways in the nervous system. It synapses between neurons. Those synapses are strengthened by reinforcement. And they're strengthened in various ways by the expression of neurotransmitters by the upstream neuron, by the proliferation of receptors in the downstream neuron, by additional synapses being sort of built off of other synapses, to increase the connections between upstream and downstream neurons. And punishment doesn't seem to work by reversing those processes. It seems to have a different mechanism of action. So, again, I don't want to get into it too deeply, partly because I don't believe that there is a good understanding of the effects of punishment at the physiological level. And I don't think it's necessary to get into that. However, I do think that the available data suggests that Asarin's theory is not sufficient by itself. There's some other, if a punitive contingency, if an aversive contingency does indeed lead to conditioned emotional responses or conditioned behavior of any sort, which it surely does through Pavlovian conditioning, then that's a fact about the behavior of the organism that should be considered when punishment is used. And if those conditioned stimuli are avoided or escaped from, we should expect there to be some sort of lawful effect on behavior. So I think Skinner's interpretation is wrong, or has been shown to be wrong. We can perhaps get along without resolving the question, and I believe that's really Asarin's point. That we can get along without having to make those inferences about punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I would regard myself as something of an iconoclast in this regard, because most people in our field have come to the conclusion that Asarin was right and Skinner was wrong.
Okay, so the last section of this chapter, Skinner titled that section "The Reader," and he describes, the effects of special conditions affecting stimulus control on the behavior of the reader. And this is a topic that you have spoken at great length about. So I would like to pass on to you the discussion of this final section.
Okay, the point of this last section is that the behavior of the reader is different from mere textual behavior. Textual behavior is the behavior of saying, either overtly or covertly, some vocal response to a textual stimulus. Reading is much more than that, because when we read something, we don't just mouth the words. Let's make the distinction between reading something in a foreign language and reading something in your native language. You could read, ignoring pronunciation differences, you can read texts in a foreign language, and that's pure textual behavior, because it's not having any additional effect on you as a speaker or a listener. Well, when you read something in your native language, the text has all kinds of evocative effects on your repertoire, as if you were listening to someone saying something. You don't simply echo what they say, you respond discriminatively to what they say. And I have a little example I did with my undergraduate students at Smith College, where I would have them read a passage from, in this case, Great Expectations. And then I would have them write as accurately as they could, write what they just read. So let me read to you the passage as it appears in Great Expectations, and then I'll read you a student's paraphrase of that passage. Here's the real passage. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable and raw afternoon toward evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pyrrhop, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. So that's the paragraph from Great Expectations, and this is what a student wrote when she attempted to write it as accurately as possible. A little boy is all alone in a graveyard. He finds the graves of his parents and reads the inscriptions on the stones. Next to those graves was a whole row of graves of his brothers and sisters. The whole family died except for him. It's cold and dark. He's all alone. He's afraid and he starts to cry. His name was Pip. Now, I think most listeners would agree that that's a reasonable paraphrase of the Dickens passage. The fact is that a lot of it's just wrong. Some of it's simply constructed by the listener. The Dickens passage doesn't say anything about the graves being the narrator's parents, nor that the others were his siblings, nor that any of them were girls, or that he was the only surviving child. It doesn't say that it was dark. It doesn't say that he was alone. It doesn't say that the narrator himself was Pip, or that Pip was a boy. All these things were added by the listener under the control of not of the passage itself, but of the listener's discriminative responses to the passage. So it simply illustrates that reading and listening are much more than simply a co-contextual behavior. There's a whole panorama of evoked behavior that is largely unobservable to an experimenter. Although to some extent it could be there can be some self-reporting. There can be you can observe people's galvanic skin responses. You can observe some features of the conditioned behavior of a listener, but for the most part, under most circumstances, all this stuff is private. But it's a very rich world, and we have to consider that rich world of experience if we're to understand the controlling variables for what follows. So it's a case where Skinner's interpretive web of concepts of covert and overt behavior, private events and public events, all need to be considered if we're going to have a comprehensive account of the behavior of even something as simple as reading and summarizing a passage.
It's also a perfect example of, the Strunk White phenomenon of using concrete terms over abstract terms. And it seems like Dickens's passage reliably had that effect on your student.
Yes, that's a good. It was full of those very vivid terms, and the student responded to those, and paraphrased them in different words. Just to close up, the listener should absolutely read the passages on page 170 and 171. It's an example in which Skinner gives two passages that are phonemically identical, but one is it's as if one is written in a foreign language. You don't recognize them as English sentences. You can recognize the sounds, but you don't put them together in the way that you would if you were hearing it in English. But when you read it when you read it in English text, it has a very different effect on the reader than if you just read the isolated syllables. So anyway, the effect is dramatic, and it illustrates the importance of these collateral responses on the part of the reader. If we don't engage in those collateral responses, the effect of a text is virtually negligible.
Okay, so that, I think that's a good place to end on this discussion. And our next topic is Chapter 7, the audience. And if there's anything you would like to say to whet the listener's appetite with respect to the chapter on the audience, I invite you to do so, but no pressure.
Well, just to remind the listener that the Skinner's book is about a lot more than just the elementary verbal operant classes. The audience is a very powerful variable, and Skinner addresses that right after. Well, that's the next topic, and it's easy to overlook that. Most competing analyses don't have the concept of the audience as an important variable. If you read a book on linguistics, for example, you don't hear about the behavior of the audience. It's all about the behavior of the speaker. So once again, Skinner's account is panoramic. It touches everything.
Thank you, Dave. And I will see you next time.
Okay, great.